Hey everyone, and welcome back to the WinShape Marriage podcast. Now, I've got to be honest, me and Marlee have probably one of the coolest jobs in the world.
Totally.
It's the opportunity to hang around WinShape Marriage and all of our marriage retreats, all of our marriage speakers, and even read all of the great marriage resources that we have on our website. And through our time with WinShape, we've accumulated quite a bit of marriage wisdom that I think has really changed our lives personally.
Yeah, we are certainly not the marriage experts, but we have got to sit under the marriage experts, and it has really, to your point, changed my marriage, changed my perspective as well. And so we were talking and we thought, okay, you know what? Instead of having the expert on again to tell you guys all the things they know, what about if you and I kind of sit down and have a conversation about some of the things that have changed our marriage and changed the way that we, that we do life with our spouse.
Yeah.
So we kind of compiled a list of 5 each of 10 total marriage advice that changed our marriage.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. This might be one of my favorite episodes.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and jump in.
Yeah.
So Marlee, I actually have a really fun story about my time with WinShape Marriage. I actually got engaged while I was in the process for interviewing for this job with WinShape.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like this weird timeline of like I'm interviewing for a job with a marriage ministry while also trying to figure out like what does it look like to set myself up well in marriage. And so I started working with our team here, and then within a few months had gotten married.
Yep.
And so it's been really cool for me personally to kind of go through all of the different resources and retreats that we have at WinShape Marriage, but also hear from speakers on like, hey, you in this newly married season, like here's some advice that might be tangible and practical for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been such a great time to, hear all of that advice and have all that wisdom spoken into me so early on in my marriage. But
yeah, I think that is a really cool story, and just really cool how the Lord kind of weaved. Well, he strategically weaved that for you and for Madeline, and kind of just this journey on your personal life and then this journey in your professional life and how those have kind of molded. It's been really cool. I didn't have quite the same story, but I do remember, when I started here, I had only been married about 3 years at that point, 2 or 3 years, and started in that, felt like what was truly was that newlywed season. And then over the past 3 years, as I've grown in my job and, professionally, I've also grown in my marriage and we are entering into a new season of marriage, as we've talked about on this podcast before. So It's just been kind of cool. I totally agree with you and resonate to be able to sit and do this for our job, but how it's blessed Cody and I and bless you and Madeline. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah. And so today, we mentioned this in the intro, but we're going to be running through just 5 quick things that each of us have learned during our time at WinShape. And would love to hear what you have first on your list.
Yeah, I feel like I have so many things. It was hard to kind of narrow down and pick, but as I was thinking back at different retreats we've attended, thinking back, I also go back and listen to each podcast episode that we do, ones that you're hosting or even the ones I'm hosting, just to kind of refresh my memory on what the marriage expert was saying. And this first one came from, I think it was from one of our podcast episodes we did this season with Dr. Julie Slattery. So Dr. Slattery, I might butcher this just a little bit, but she was basically saying that women, and this is a stereotype, so of course, with anything like this, it doesn't mean every single person will fall into it, but fall into this category. But women like to process life together, talk through their feelings, talk through just what they're thinking, what they're experiencing. And men like to do life together. To be out doing, being active with their spouse, and maybe not always sitting and quote unquote talking. And I thought that felt very true for my marriage, and just thinking about how a lot of times I like to just sit and talk and like, how's your heart? How are you doing? How's your job? Like how are you feeling about X, Y, or Z?
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of sit and process with Cody. And I think a lot of times he likes to go out and do with me. And so we're wired differently.
Yeah. I was going to ask, like, how does that play out for you and Cody, like real tangibly? Like, when it comes to like talking and processing versus doing life together, like what has been your biggest like life change that's come from hearing that, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I think, and I'll give him credit, like he is a talker too. So he does, do well to listen and sit and process and things with me. But I think a lot of times we see fruit sometimes when we're just like, we'll go on a walk around the neighborhood and sometimes we don't actually talk at all. Like it's not even like we're not mad or frustrated. It's just, we're so comfortable with each other that it's just nice to just each be able, it doesn't always feel like we're having to talk. So I feel like being able to know and like dedicate in my mind, like if I really am struggling with something, being able to tell him and give him an expectation of like, hey, I really want to talk through like what is like going on in my brain right now. Like I need some time to process with you versus sometimes knowing that if we're just going around on a walk or we like to work out and stuff together sometimes. So when we're doing that, we're definitely not doing a lot of talking and processing, but just the act of being together and being in one another's company has really, I don't know, I see it play out just in our different personalities. Yeah,
and that makes me think of our conversation we had with Chauncey Feldhahn maybe a few weeks ago. And we were talking about what all these national research studies had found about the differences between how men receive love and how women receive love. It was just really fascinating. But one of the things that she said in the episode was one of men's biggest things is the need for companionship or just to have a best friend. And so she talked about like for guys, it means the world to literally just go through life together. And so like running to Costco or like going for a walk, like what you're saying. And so that connection is there even just from those small moments and not necessarily like having, it sounds like to dive in and have like deep conversations or some things like that. It's just like having that companion to go through life with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then it makes it, when you're able to have that, then it makes those times when you're talking feel, less, not so much pressure on them. Like you're able to experience those moments a little bit more comfortably too. It doesn't feel like there's like all these things at stake because you've been doing life together.
And it's almost like you have to balance the talking and the doing, like living together, And if you get out of whack, like sometimes you can get some fatigue from like, oh, we've just had so many like deep processing conversations. Like, can we just go out and like do life together? It sounds like. And so I think that's a great takeaway too, is just look for that balance in your relationship. Yeah.
So maybe ask yourselves, is it similar for you guys? Like for the husbands, do you find that you resonate with that you like to do life together? And women, do you like to process life together? It might be reversed for your relationship too, but I think just talking through, hey, which one of those like resonated with you more?
Yeah, that's great. Now, for me, this one is huge, and this is one that literally has transformed my perspective, not just on my marriage, but also my life as a whole, which has been really cool. We were going through WinShape's like leadership training process, and our speaker, Jeremy Marshall, another guest that we had on the podcast, was talking about Jesus. He used this verse. He said, Luke 2:52, which reads, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man." And the point that he was making was like, even Jesus, the Son of God, went through this period on earth where he's increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man.
I remember this.
And for me, as a guy that kind of got married a little bit young, it's kind of this encouraging point to hear like, okay, even I can have permission for myself to have that space to like learn and grow and develop, That's you're not going to step into marriage and be a complete picture of what a husband is supposed to be. Like it takes some work to get there. And so for me, when you think about, I want to be more like Jesus, when you think of Jesus, at least for me, like my Sunday school picture of Jesus was like, he's perfect, didn't do anything wrong. And so it almost feels like this unattainable standard, you know? And so for me, it was really encouraging to hear like, no, it's okay to give yourself that permission and that space and that grace to say like, hey, it's gonna take some time to get to what the Lord is ultimately calling you to be. And you probably like will be on that journey for years and years and years. But just to go into open-handed and say like, God, what do you want from me in this season?
Yeah, I think that's so good. And that is so true. As someone who's grown up a believer and grown up in the church, a lot of times you do think of Jesus just as this adult, right? Like he was perfect. He was the Son of God. And you forget that he, you remember really, you reflect on it at Christmas time when you're talking about the babe in the manger. But other than that, a lot of times you forget, you tend to forget that he did start out as he came as a baby, and then he didn't grow from a baby to in his 30s like overnight. Like he went through the same adolescent years and young years that the rest of us did. And I love that. That's something that can apply so well directly into your marriage, of like, you will always be on a journey of becoming a better wife, a better husband. And then you're always hopefully on a journey of growing and becoming more and more like Christ in your personal life, in your work life, however that plays out. So
and I just find myself at this place of like I said, going open-handed to God and saying like, hey, I'm in the season of growth and transition. I'm growing in wisdom and stature, I hope.
Yeah.
And so like, God, what does that look like for me? Not just in a work context or not just in a personal context, but also in a marriage context as well, which I think is one piece of advice that has really changed a lot for me. So
I love that you started out with that one, because it like kind of almost, maybe we should have had you start with that one, because it kind of sets up the rest of them of like, you can grow in each of these things.
Yeah, for sure.
That we're going to be able to talk about. Okay, so my second one here, it kind of plays off of the first one a little bit, but it kind of was a little bit more related to conflict. So this one also came from podcast episode with Dr. David Banks, and he was talking about with him and his wife at one point, I think maybe he was saying early in their marriage, but they were going on a date night or doing a date night, and it didn't go well, that they felt like they didn't really have a lot to talk about, that they weren't really connecting. And so instead they ended up just playing music and just kind of being together. And he was encouraging us that it's okay, especially sometimes if you are going through some conflict or just some tension in your relationship too, to just sit and be together. Like you don't have to figure it out completely and totally in one setting perfectly. And this played out recently for Cody and I. There was just a period where we just felt like we were just missing each other. I don't even remember what the conflict necessarily was, but there was just some tension over a period of a couple of days where we just felt like we just were not, like we were just kept missing each other.
Oh, yeah.
And every time we would try to sit down and like talk through it and figure out like, what is going on? Why are we keep missing each other? It wasn't going well. Like it kept resulting in more tension. And finally he said, hey, next time that we're together, I just want to watch a movie. Like, let's just sit on the couch, watch a movie, and bring it back down, like bring the temperature back down. And then that will set us up hopefully better for success when we do talk. Like he was not saying, let's just forget this and ignore it and it'll go away. But he was like, I just need time for us to just sit and be together, and then let's go from there. And so I was like, okay, I hear you. So we did. So the next time that we were together, because, we were working and jobs and things, instead of talking or doing, we sat and we just watched a movie, and it was low stakes, low key. We didn't talk. We were still a little bit like frustrated, but we just sat, and then it opened up and kind of brought the temperature down, and it was able to allow us next time to have a more fruitful and productive conversation.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like in the same vein of your first point that you're making about this idea of balance between like having the hard conversations versus just going out and having fun and doing life together. It also kind of makes me think of Gottman has this thing it's called like the golden ratio, which is basically like how much appreciation you show versus like how much criticism that you show in your marriage. And I think, I don't know the specific number, but I think it's like 3-to-1 or 5-to-1, but basically saying like you should show like 5 positive points of appreciation towards your spouse for every like 1 negative thing. Like that's what it takes to offset the negativity, because in our brains, like we weight negativity much stronger than we do like positive comments, And so it almost makes me think about this too, of like, in order to have those hard conversations or to get to a place where you want to have a serious in-depth discussion, like you need that relational equity a little bit. And so that relational equity isn't just from, hey, we're going to keep on talking and eventually get to that point, but like you need to build it up in other ways, like going to see a movie or something like that, to where like you feel in a good enough spot to where you're like, okay, I feel like I can let my walls down now, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's funny how a lot of these things, they really do play off of each other. And I think that's something that is encouraging for me, because it's like a lot of these speakers and people that we've heard and experts, they're saying a lot of the same things. They're saying it in different ways, and it's coming across in different ways, and it relates to you. You might pick up something, a different point, differently than the rest. But a lot of them have, like, we'll see throughout, I think, some similar themes woven throughout, which is encouraging, because it's like, okay, we're on the right track here.
Yep.
What do you got?
All right, so
next?
my next one, and this is one that became evident to me through just going through life. And then I talked with some host couples, some older couples, about like what I was experiencing, and they're like, yep, that's spot on. And so it's this statement: is it your spouse or the season? And so I'll give the example of kind of what led me to get to this point is like, for whatever reason, every time Madeline and I move into a new house, it's like we are at odds with each other for whatever reason. And I was like, okay, this is weird. This has happened 3 times now. We've moved into 3 different places. And there was one point where we just had a conversation, and I was like, oh, wait, we're just stressed out. Like, we're just going through a hard time. Like, anytime that you have a like change in your life, or your routines are disrupted or something like that, like things will be a little bit stressful. And when you're feeling a little bit stressed, like you're not at the best version of yourself. And anytime that you bring less than the best version of yourself into your relationship or into your marriage, like you're just setting yourself up to like expose that stress to your spouse, whether it be in like through conflict, or maybe through like actions that maybe aren't the most uplifting, or whatever it may be. And so I was talking with older couples, and they were like, yeah, that's 100% the case, is like you will go through seasons of life that are hard or stressful or difficult. Like when you think about the holidays, like it can be such an emotional time for people. And so like you might be in a situation where you and your spouse are butting heads or whatnot, and you're thinking like, why are they on a different page than me? When in reality, like it's just a hard season for them. Like maybe they lost a parent during the holidays. And so it's just taking a step back and saying, hey, is this conflict that we're experiencing, is this something that is just because we're not on the same page? Or is it some deeper factor, like we're stressed, a lot's going on with work, the kids have been kind of challenging lately, whatever it is, like maybe we can take a step back and realize like that's not just the only thing at hand. Like there are other bigger factors at play here.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that's one that can apply, like you're saying, completely across the board. It can apply on a holiday specific situation, can apply if you're moving. I'm already like, I'm tucking that away. I actually haven't heard you say that before. So I'm about to tuck that away, because when we do welcome our daughter, it's like, is it my spouse, or is it the season that we're in? And I have a feeling that it's going to be a little bit of the season that we're in. We're going to be exhausted.
But that's great. Like that's a perfect example of when you have a new baby, you're probably not sleeping a lot. There's probably a whole range of newness that you're not familiar with. All of your routines are kind of out the window. So that's a great example too. And the other thing I think about too is, being a newly married young person, is I have a lot of friends that are kind of in that season. And one thing that I see happen over and over and over again when people first step into marriage is it's just an overlap of all of this newness. So like when you first get married, you move into a new place. You have a new living person. Like you've probably never lived with this person before. You might be starting a new job in a new city.
For sure.
And so all of those new seasons just contribute stress. And so you find yourself not just in like a slightly stressful season, but like this hugely stressful season of like all of this new change. And so I think when I talk to like newly married couples, that's one thing that from the outside you can see like, oh, there's a lot of change going on in your life. But when you're in it and in the moment, it can be hard to see that. So taking that step back and saying, hey, is it my spouse or the season, could be a really helpful thing.
I love that. Is it my spouse or my season? Okay, I'm remembering that one. I have on here, this came directly from a retreat that Cody and I were at, and one of our WinShape Marriage retreats. And we talk a lot about how many of our experiences, we bring in this aspect of what we call experiential learning. We bring in this aspect of play and like doing these different activities, a lot of times with your spouse to connect something that the speaker is saying to what, or to connect the activity back to what the speaker is saying to help you like tangibly process what they're talking about. And so this played out for Cody and I. We were challenged with solving a riddle together. And we were like doing it while we were struggling. It was like we were on a time crunch and we were trying to figure out this riddle. And we succeeded in figuring out the riddle. And each of us were able to contribute a part to the riddle. Like, I can't remember who, but he figured out like the first part of the riddle but he couldn't get to the end of it. And then whatever he figured out jogged my memory or jogged me to be able to figure out like how to actually complete the riddle. So we both played a part in completing this riddle. And what happened was then he was trying to explain to me what he figured out. And then I was trying to explain to him how what he figured out helped me figure out what I was doing. Okay.
Sounds like a riddle in itself.
I know, right? It's a riddle trying to figure out the riddle. So anyways, the big light bulb moment that went off for me that I will never forget for like ever was when we were explaining to each other. He was explaining super fast, like how he figured it out. And I was like, I need you to explain that again. And I actually ended up timing us. I was so curious. So I timed him explaining. It took him 15 seconds to explain his portion. And then it took me 45 seconds to explain mine. So 3 times the pace that it took him. And it was like, oh my goodness, so many light bulbs went off. And me just realizing how that I process a lot slower. Like my brain processes slower than Cody. That we're both like intelligent and smart and we can figure out this riddle, right? But whatever I was doing, I needed 3 times the amount of time he needed to. And this plays out in our marriage a lot because he is such a quick thinker. He works in the emergency room. So he has got to think so fast. And I am a writer and I do content. And so I think slower. And so sometimes we're talking and I tell him, I'm like, hey, I'm hearing you. I need you to slow it down 3 times though. Like it's a little bit, I need you to repeat that or whatever the case may be. And so anyways, it was just such a cool moment for me. How I think this could play out for those listening is like, do something with your spouse, like solve a puzzle together, like look up a riddle together or garden together or do something together and see how you do the activity differently. And you might not have the same light bulb moment and that's totally okay too, but see how something, if you're doing, how it might affect how you process differently.
That's a great point. I think about when you talk about yourself and how you think about yourself, you might think about yourself one way, but then when you actually like live out or experience things, it might come out in different ways. And so like, for example, at retreats, when we ask couples like, hey, how are you feeling in this season? They might say like, oh, we feel good or we feel fine or whatever. But then if you say like, hey, paint your current season of marriage on a canvas or something like that, or point to a picture that represents how you're feeling right now in marriage. And as soon as you take it from, hey, I'm using words to, hey, I'm using a different medium, it's really interesting to see how people will use different interpretations and really be able to point to feelings in a slightly different way. And so I think, it's a spot on idea of looking for a different outlet or a different medium that you can use to kind of analyze, hey, this is where we're coming from in marriage.
I do love that example too. We do that a lot with the pictures.
Yeah.
And the weather example of like what picture of a weather would describe how you're feeling right now.
Yeah.
And you both might, like, if, like, to your point about the moving, maybe both of you, the word you would use was stress. But then maybe you and Madeline would look at a picture and you might pick a picture of a thunderstorm and she might pick a picture of a snowstorm or something. And it's like, okay, we both described it as stressful, but I'm curious why you chose that different picture.
Yeah.
It completely can shape differently.
Yeah. It's a great like processing framework. Like, hey, what season do I feel like my marriage is in right now? And then force yourself to try and explain that.
Yes.
You know, and then you'll find like all these different words that maybe you didn't think of before.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
So next up on my list, this is one, you mentioned your last one was from a retreat. This was also from a retreat. This is from our Courageous Communication retreat at WinShape, which I cannot recommend highly enough.
Such a good,
it's one of those you'll walk away and you'll think, man, like, I wish I knew this 10 years ago, you know? So in the retreat, they talk about this idea of a fear cycle and a peace cycle for conflict. And so for me, the thing that resonated most is I'm think of myself as like a somewhat logical person. And so I really enjoy taking things that feel emotional or complex or whatever and just looking at it from a logical perspective. And so that's kind of what they do in the retreat is talking about like, hey, when conflict actually happens between you and your spouse, what is actually happening? And so they have this diagram and it starts with, hey, usually conflict happens when one of you catches the other one sideways. So maybe you make a comment of like, hey, why aren't the dishes done? Maybe you make a comment about, I don't know, something like, hey, why didn't you pick up the kids from soccer practice or whatever? Or like, why are you acting like that? Something. That will trigger a fear within your spouse, some kind of like deep underlying thing that maybe they don't necessarily realize, like, hey, I'm not good enough, or hey, I'm lacking as a husband, or something like that. And so when that button goes off, your spouse has a decision to make. It's like, hey, do I come back with another thing and point it back at my spouse and say maybe something that will push their buttons?
Yeah.
Or do I change the story and say, no, I'm going to stop this cycle and maybe say something uplifting or work towards resolution in conflict?
Yeah.
And so for me, it's been helpful because you realize like, hey, if your spouse says something that sets off your buttons, or maybe you unintentionally say something to your spouse that triggers their buttons and then they say something back to you, you can either work towards more conflict, like you can continue feeding into the cycle of like continuing to pile on and say, well, you didn't do the laundry, well, you didn't do the dishes, you know, kind of like go into that cycle of like intensifying this conflict. Or you can get to this place where if your spouse says, hey, like, I'm really upset, like you didn't pick up the kids, you can say, you're right, I'm so sorry. And then work towards resolution at that point. And so I think for me, it's just a helpful model of thinking through like, how can I work towards resolution and not towards intensifying conflict, which I think is helpful for sure. Yeah. One piece of feedback I found myself when my wife and I are in conflict is I try to find myself looking for opportunities to say, you're right. So like if your spouse is like, hey, I've really been feeling like you haven't been prioritizing quality time with me lately. Instead of saying like, no, I have, of course I have. Maybe just say like, you know what, you're right. And then use that to work towards resolution and conflict and maybe tell a different story of how conflict goes. So.
That's great. Maybe are you leading our next Courageous
Communication?
No, I think you did a beautiful job explaining that. And I've attended that as well. And it's not something that's easy to just pick up right away. Yeah. Like it has to take some time to really process. That has been the theme of this episode, apparently, is processing. But it takes time to process and understand that cycle for sure. So I would encourage anyone listening, like, hey, if that was interesting to you, what Rob was describing, and you did a fantastic job describing it, then we do offer that retreat several times a year for that reason of just, you can spend kind of the weekend thinking through those different cycles and understanding like, are we on a fear cycle right now, or can we get on a peace cycle right now? But it's definitely eye-opening for sure. I love how you have taken that and applied it directly for you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so we're moving right along here. This is my fourth kind of marriage thing that has changed my outlook. And this also came from a WinShape Marriage retreat. So I've mentioned how a lot of times, you hear this phrase, opposites attract, and you marry someone different than your spouse. And I do think like we are all uniquely made in the image of God. Like we are all different. And a lot of times this does play out in marriage where you marry someone that is very different than you. And there are definitely ways I've already shared in this episode, like where Cody and I are different. But overarchingly, actually, a lot of times Cody and I find we're very similar. When we've done things at WinShape, when we've done the color wheels, we're both orange.
Or like an Enneagram or something like that.
We are a lot similar in a lot of ways. We're both extroverted. It's not like one's introverted, one's extroverted. We're both very extroverted. We're both like to be busy and things. So all of this to say, sometimes we actually feel like we're the minority when we're in a room at a marriage retreat or at a place when a lot of times the speakers are like, and you and your spouse are probably different, and you and your spouse are probably different. And sometimes Cody and I look at each other and we're like, but we're not really different. Like we sometimes feel like we're very similar. And I remember asking one time in like a Q&A session, I was like, hey, you guys keep saying that here's how you need to, approach your spouse, especially if they're different than you. But Cody and I aren't different in this way. What advice do you have for us?
Yeah.
And this person said to us, I think a trap that you guys might fall into is thinking because you are so similar, well, I already know what you're going to say.
Yeah.
Or I already know how you're going to respond. I already know what you're going to do because I am you or I'm like you. And I was like, oh man, that was humbling because that has totally happened where I'm like, well, I already know you're going to act like X, Y, or Z because that's how I would act. And
like you can almost read his mind a little bit.
Which sets up for failure because no matter how similar we think we are, we aren't mind readers.
Yeah.
And sometimes we might be right. But if we set ourselves up thinking that and going in with this like confidence of, oh, well, I already know, then we're automatically setting every time we've done it, it has never worked out well. And so this was just a big light bulb for me. And it might play out for those listening. Maybe you are different. Maybe you don't relate to me and what I'm saying and that are similar.
Yeah.
But sometimes you can find yourself, if you've been together a long time, like we've been married 6 years, we've been together 11 years at this point.
Yeah.
And so it's like you sometimes can fall into this trap of like, we're really comfortable with each other and I just already know. And that's dangerous because you were constantly, hopefully, back to your point of your very first one about growing in wisdom and stature.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're always growing and changing and evolving in new ways. And if we relegate ourselves to just think we just already know how our spouse is going to be, that can be frustrating.
Yeah, no, for sure. It makes me think of this one study I read. We have to link it in the show notes, but it was essentially tracking couples and how long they had been together. And what they found is the longer amount of time a couple had been together, the more likely they were to assume they knew what their spouse was thinking.
Yeah.
And the more likely they were to be wrong.
Yeah.
And so it's this point of like, as you go on, like you've maybe been married 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, you might think you know what your spouse is thinking or where they're at. But a lot of times those assumptions can not be the right assumptions, you know? And so that just emphasizes how important it is to actually not just assume, but to have the conversations.
Yeah.
And say like, hey, like I might think you're like this, but let's talk about it, get confirmation on where your spouse is at.
And, I will say hopefully there are going to be times, like there are, little moments and things where I'm like, oh, I just knew he was going to, twitch his eyes a certain way when he said that story because I know when he says that story, whatever. And those are comforting. And like, so I think it's it's good to just keep in check, like, hey, hopefully when you've been together long enough, there are those tendencies and things you pick up on because you are so comfortable.
Yeah.
You know that about your spouse. But I think the important thing I took away from this is just remembering not to say 10 out of 10 times, every single time I'm going to know, and just always be curious and let yourself be surprised if you aren't right. Or if you end up being right and you're like, I called it, then let it be like kind of an after the fact of like, hey, I was thinking that you're probably going to do that and you did. And that was like comforting to me because I do know you well.
Yeah. But I love your point about being curious about your spouse.
Yeah.
Even when you're 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in, just keep that curiosity and just say like, hey, I want to be a student of like what you're passionate about, like what you're excited about, like how you're feeling. Yeah. And so I think that's great for sure. All right, next up on my list, this one kind of goes hand in hand with the point I made right before this, but it's assume the best and recognize you're on the same team. Followed up by the statement, it says, do you want to be right or in relationship?
Oh, yes.
And so I think a lot of times going back to conflict, you can a lot of times have this tendency to want to win. Yeah. Like I think a lot of like conflict, we're just kind of wired to want to win, like in a debate setting.
All the competitors in the room are like, yes, that's me.
Yeah, for sure. And so you're trying to like one up your spouse or prove your point or get them to see your side of things. I think it's helpful in that moment where you catch yourself thinking like, I'm trying to prove them wrong, to say, is my goal for this conflict to be right or to be in relationship? Yeah. What would it look like to change the way I'm speaking in this conversation to pursue relationship over being right? And one helpful thing for me, and I think for a lot of people, is to recognize that you and your spouse are on the same team. If one of you walks away from conflict feeling like you won, it's a quote from Sean Stover, your relationship probably lost. And so it's this idea of how can we as a team win through this conflict and not necessarily me as an individual, which I think is a really helpful model to think through.
I love that one. I love when it's something that's such a tangible, like a question that you can latch onto. Yeah. Is it my spouse or is it this season? Do I want to be right or do I want to be in relationship? And that leads me to my last point that I have here, which is another one that's similar. And that is, am I listening right now to understand or am I listening to respond? Yeah. And I feel like that plays perfectly on the right in relationship, because if I'm listening to just respond, then it's probably, I'm also falling for the trap of I just want to be right. Yeah. Because I'm like, what did he say? And I'm just going to respond to that one thing that he said. And I'm already gearing up in my brain, like my response. And he hasn't even finished speaking and talking through what he's like sharing. Or am I listening to understand what he's saying? Am I taking a step back? And I keep, I'm saying he and thinking of with Cody and I, but am I listening to truly understand right now where he's coming from because I want to be in relationship? Or am I listening to just, get my like one-liner out? Yeah,
no, for sure. And if you're in a situation where you're the kind of person that is always just jumping to what you're going to say next and maybe not the best about like active listening. One technique that's really helpful is, I think it's called like mirroring. I don't know if that's the right term, but essentially when your spouse finishes saying something, force yourself to kind of recap what they were saying. Yeah. So if they're like, hey, like I really wish you did the dishes or whatever, you can say, I hear what you're saying is, and then kind of repeat that. And that is a good way of like forcing yourself to not just jump in and think of the next response, but actually listen, because you have to, for yourself, like restate what they're saying, Yeah. And so it can be a good way of preventing yourself from jumping ahead too much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That covers my list of 5 things that I think have really changed the aspect of my marriage. Do you have one more on yours?
I'll move on to my last one. Okay. And this kind of goes hand in hand with one of the things you said earlier, but I think one thing that's become evident to me interacting with couples further down the line in marriage is just how important it is to continue celebrating and playing together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think through when you first start dating, it's really easy to go out and play, to go on dates, to have fun, to get out of the box. And then once you get married, maybe you have kids, you get more into these routines and you get more into like, oh no, like Thursdays I have to take my son to soccer practice, and Fridays we have to do this, and Saturdays, whatever it may be. And in that, one of the first things that typically falls off of your calendar is play.
Yeah.
And having that space to have fun together.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about this idea of balance earlier in conflict, of trying to balance being serious and having deep processing conversations with also watching movies,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And that goes for life in general, is like if you have lots of serious, hard things like doing taxes and going to work and making sure your kid goes to the doctor when they're feeling sick or whatever it may be, like it's important to balance that out with intentional time to play together.
Yeah.
And so I think we can pretty easily fall into that trap if we're not careful.
Yeah.
And one of the pieces of feedback I've heard from couples is like, just make sure you get that on the calendar.
Yeah.
When the month comes around and you're looking at like, okay, we're going to be at this place here, I have a work trip here, whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm.
In that moment, before anything else goes on the calendar, make sure that you prioritize play. And say like, hey, on this day, we're going to do this really fun activity that we've never done before.
Yeah.
And so just cutting out that intentional time, I think, is really important. And then also this piece of celebrating together.
Yeah.
I think it's really easy to forget to celebrate yourself in your marriage. And so those anniversaries are a great example of like, we've made it 10 years or 20 years. Like really celebrate that. Not just like, oh, I got you flowers and okay, that's great. But like celebrate that accomplishment. And same thing with like wins with work or wins with relationships or whatever it may be. But just like taking that time to celebrate and say, hey, like we have accomplished something together.
Yeah. We're going to be celebrating later this month. Cody started a new job in the ER, and he is finally getting his first ER paycheck, and that is super exciting. And so, to your point, it's like it doesn't always have to be like the big, huge things, but we're gonna go out and have a nice dinner and celebrate because it's like, hey, you did that. You completed that first long stretch of work in the ER, and you got a paycheck for it, and we're gonna go celebrate that.
Yeah, no, that's a great. Like job change is the perfect example of like, what does it look like to celebrate your spouse in that season? Because we talked about the positive and the negative, like golden ratio thing. Like when you are lighthearted, play together and celebrate, it only makes it even easier to have those hard conversations because you have that relational equity. Like you have that trust built up. Like, hey, we've gone through fun seasons together. We can go through hard seasons together too, which I think is a great reminder.
I love that. I feel like I have learned a lot just in my time at WinShape. And I know that everyone, again, doesn't work for WinShape Marriage and have the opportunity to sit in the situations or the seats that you and I are sitting in. But even I've just learned from you and the things that you've taken away in your time at WinShape, which is really cool. I think the important thing to take away from this conversation, if you're listening, is I'm not going to be able to take all 10 of these things, the 5 things Marlee said, the 5 things Rob said, and implement them right away.
Yeah, for sure.
But just like Rob and I over the past several years have taken these things, like it's taken time for us to build up kind of our bank of what has really changed our perspective. What was 1 or 2 things that we said that aren't original to us, thank goodness.
Thank goodness.
We have gotten, maybe what's 1 or 2 things that you heard in this conversation that you're like, wow, okay, they're newly married. They took this. It changed their perspective. We are also newly married. We're in a new, or we're just in a, we haven't figured it all out either.
Yeah.
Maybe you've been married 10 or 15 years, but we haven't figured it all out either. And I loved this thing, and take it away and maybe have a conversation with your spouse about it. See where it lands with you.
Yeah, definitely just pick maybe 1 or 2 and just think about it deeper. Maybe have a conversation with your spouse, but definitely, that's great feedback, Marlee.
Yeah.
Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation today. I
too.
hope those listening really got a lot from this episode.
Hope
and
so.
if you're tuned into this episode, thank you so much for listening. And we'll catch you right back here next week.
Yeah, next week. Hey there. If you're enjoying this conversation, make sure to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more marriage resources. And let us know what you think of this episode in the comments below.